Hello there everyone, pishifat here with some exciting new news. Anyone who recognizes that modified quote knows exactly what I'll be talking about today. Mapping politics have a track record of never being tame, well, with opinions differing between everyone on everything, but what if I told you there was a time in history when mappers were all on the same wavelength? An event where mappers banded together to express a single unified belief, all for the sake of saving the future of mapping. You'd think that tacky film pitch is a lie. Aside from when the community was too small to have any major disagreements, it seems unrealistic for hundreds of diverse mappers in the modern day to share thoughts on the same topic, and yet, it's happened. It's happened twice actually, depending on how you look at it, both in response to the same thing: map set difficulty spread regulations. It's time for the exciting new news, everyone. In this ranking criteria direct ranking criteria adjustment given no prior community input, there were three main changes redefining what made map sets rankable. First was a relatively well-received one. It was actually a loosening of rules, allowing mappers to worry less about the precision of difficulty spreads in the uppermost range. At the time, the average map set had some basic ranking requirements. There had to be 2 difficulties, the lowest of those couldn't be harder than a normal below 2 stars, and any preceding difficulties needed to follow a decent difficulty curve. Simply put, that means if you wanted an insane difficulty, you'd need a hard difficulty in between. In reality, it's more complicated than that, so if you're curious, one of my oldest videos details how this works. Anyway, what this new rule did was revoke the following a decent difficulty curve aspect of spreads past expert difficulties. If you wanted a super hardcore 8-star map ranked, you'd previously need multiple experts to make the steps in difficulty reasonable, but the new rule cut that out, permitting larger gaps between hardest difficulties and allowing less work for mappers. Doesn't sound too bad, but that's where it gets you. The first rule change here is the most positive, warming readers up to the negative adjustments that come straight after. Every map set is limited to 1 of each difficulty level. You know how tons of ranked maps have multiple insanes or multiple extras or this advanced difficulty between normal and hard? Yeah, not allowed under the new rule set. Map sets were required to be as concise as possible, which had some problems. One appeal of having multiple insane difficulties is to give players a choice between styles at a difficulty level where variation is more common, hence why these are usually guessed difficulties. Yet with the change here, the only way to rank these different styles would be through spamming tons of separate map sets. That's not especially bad, but given how spreads function on OSU and how this new rule only allows 1 of each type, that would mean each map in a set would fall into the mid-range of its difficulty, eliminating any maps on the upper or lower edges and ultimately seeming like more work for less value. The final rule affected marathons in a similarly oppressive way. If they included an expert difficulty, they now needed an insane as well. Marathons back then referred to maps with 5 minutes of drain time, rankable with exception from ordinary spread rules because, well, they're just a lot of mapping. This new rule took the balance that made marathons and proper spreads for shorter songs equal, and unbalanced it in favor of normal spreads. So BS, this was all BS. The ranking criteria changed for the worse without community input, only by contribution of a ranking criteria council whose word was final and who apparently didn't fully agree with the changes in the first place. Likewise, players and mappers swarmed the thread with a mix of criticism and posting garbage. For hours, there was a new post every 30 seconds, making for the most active forum thread in OSU history. And one of those posts was a straw poll too, inaccurately showing that 2% of people were neutral on the changes, 4% agreed with them, 77% were against them, and 17% chose the meme response. Even that says something though. When the meme answer has severely less votes than a real answer, that's a sign people are really mad. 600 posts of disapproval later, Peppy was awoken, and he casually locked the thread for some internal discussion, ensuring the new rules wouldn't be implemented at the time. The day was saved until a new post was made about how slightly more loosened but still gross rules would be used instead. And then the day was saved again, after which point the thread was never touched. This map set and spread restructure was put back on the shelf after its more than severe backlash, until a year later when, in a different fashion, it was partially revived thanks to a miscommunication. Hi Mom, that's me. I was the guy whose name was unfortunately attached to the spread rule set draft proposal. This was part of the ranking criteria rewrite project, which means it had a lot of changes and all, but the main one people really cared about was map sets cannot include more than 8 total difficulties of a single game mode. It was made pretty clear last time that nobody wanted difficulty limitations. 8 may be more lenient, but what's the harm in having more than that? Nobody plays every difficulty in a map set anyway, meaning coherency within a spread isn't all that important, and giving players a choice between more difficulties only seems like a plus. This rule, like the previously forced ones, is unnecessary, so why was it proposed? That miscommunication I mentioned was between higher-ups on Osu and the lowly ranking criteria organizers. We were told that the game's developers were intent on adding a restriction to the amount of difficulties that could be submitted in a map set, which would make ranked maps feel more like reasonably chunked, regulated content. The only way to stop that from happening was supposedly implementing a more lenient limit through the ranking criteria. If developers saw that map sets were all under an 8 difficulty limit, the hope was that they'd consider that workable and avoid their own stricter limitation. Supposedly. Was that impending 5 diff limit really worth worrying about though? Hard to say. I haven't heard word about it since. During Osu's panel last year at Anime Expo though, this topic was brought up by a mapper vocally against the 8 diff rule.
Hey Peppy, I'm only asking Peppy.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the proposal to limit ranked beat maps to 8 difficulties?
Sounds good. You don't want too many difficulties. It just gets out of hand.
Really?
So maybe developers would prefer less difficulties, but with every mapper disagreeing, I can't imagine it ever being implemented. And luckily, this second iteration of spread rules wasn't as commanding as the first. This was a proposal, so given community input said to kill the rule, killed it was. That isn't to say a difficulty limit is completely out of line for Osu though. Back in the early days, there was an actual rule on the ranking criteria doing just that, stating a map set could have no more than 5 diffs total. Mappers were okay with it because that was the norm at the time, yet as the years passed, rules loosened. The 5 diff limit was removed, marathons needed 6 minutes of drain time to be rankable, then 5 minutes, and with the new ranking criteria change, spread requirements have loosened even more. The latest proposal here aimed to balance number of difficulties versus amount of mapping required, and as of a month ago is part of the ranking criteria. Under the new rules, the lowest difficulty of a set does not need to be at max a normal anymore. If above 3 minutes 30 seconds, it can be a hard diff, above 4:15 it can be an insane, and above 5 minutes it can be an extra, the last of those being allowed under the old rules. This means less mapping is required for longer maps, and more effort can be put towards the difficulties that mappers actually care about. Unlike the last two proposals, public feedback on this one was more positive. Even with some restrictive guidelines added, that was a small price to pay for the quality of life improving rule changes. After a long discussion and modification to the proposal, plus approval from the PEP himself, it was amended to the ranking criteria and applies to newly ranked maps. This is a game changer for mapping, and with something so big comes doubts. There's always a chance that less low difficulties will drive new players away from the game, or that unclear requirements for hard and insane difficulties will lead to breaking of these rules. My response on the thread is pretty speculative too. Even if I'm not entirely in favor of the changes though, I recognize that adding more restrictions to the ranking criteria's rules kinda goes against how the game functions. Supremely powerful councils of people and the preferences of higher-ups don't control how mapping is handled. That stuff will only be rejected and shot down. What can succeed is widely agreed upon changes, and with so many people giving opinions, that will almost always be a one-way road. We're not game designers aiming for cohesive, all-inclusive experiences with every BMap download, which the first two spread rule sets intended. We're just randos who make maps, and we'd like it if mapping rules, spread or otherwise, were in our favor. Osu is the rare kind of game where it's proven that can actually succeed, and I think that's pretty cool. Yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.